Kemi Badenoch, thanks so much for joining us on TNG this morning.
Thank you, Tom. I'm happy to be here.
Can we start by perhaps pinning down the scale of what you think the current challenge is? How much of a problem is racial equality in the UK to date, to, for example, what it might have been maybe 20 or 30 years ago?
It's a really good question. The reason why we launched this strategy was in response to the events 2 years ago related to Black Lives Matter protests, the COVID disparity, disproportionate impacts on ethnic minorities, and just a general observation that there was a trust deficit in society, not just in government or parliament, but institutions like the NHS, the police, education. And we wanted to go into the root causes of what was causing disparities that did exist, as well as the strength of feeling, because we also believed that things had improved significantly when it came to racial equality over multiple decades.
So significantly, it's half the problem it used to be. It's a quarter of the problem it used to be. Is there any way of quantifying that?
I don't think there is a way of quantifying it, and also expectations change. So what people might have thought was good in 1970 or 1990, they might not think is good enough now. And I think it's our job to make sure that we are striving for continuous improvement, to use corporate jargon. But what we look at as a government is how to make sure that the quality of life for people continues to improve, even as expectations do.
Would you say someone's race is still the biggest determining factor in equality in the UK, equality of opportunity or outcomes, or is it something else now, like geography?
No. The evidence doesn't bear that out. It doesn't mean that someone's race might not have no impact whatsoever on their life experiences or life outcomes, but other factors have a much bigger impact on what happens to you in life. So when the commission looked at the evidence, it found things like geography, yes, family, background, culture, family structure and stability, education, all of those things had an impact. And race did have something to do with how people perceived their sense of inclusion and belonging, which is a much harder thing to pin down. It's a very, very difficult thing to pin down. It's more emotional than fact or evidence-based. It's about how people feel. So we're also trying to look at that, even though from a policy perspective, the levers aren't as clear as what you do to improve education or what you do to improve a place.
So you don't like the phrase institutional racism, neither does the Sewell report, which is what your action plan was based on. So in your view, is there any institution in the UK that is still racist?
So it's not that we don't like the phrase, it's that we want it applied appropriately. Institutional racism has a very specific meaning, and people often conflate it with racism, and they are two different things related. So the way I like to explain it is we see crime in our country every day, all over the place. There are thousands of people who are arrested, put in prison, yet we don't call our country institutionally criminal. There is a much higher threshold, a much higher bar for describing something as institutionally racist. And the definition we use is the Macpherson definition, which talks about certain organizational behaviors that are systemic, repeatedly failing people from a particular background because of the color of their skin. So it has something specific. And what the commission found was it didn't see evidence of it where it looked. It didn't mean that there's never been any institutional racism or there's no racism in the country. Of course not. In fact, it emphasized that racism still blights people's lives and gave recommendations on how to repair it. So the really sad thing about what happened last year was the way the discussion was misrepresented in such a toxic way, making it seem as if the commissioners were racism deniers. And in fact, a lot of what I'm having to do now is rebut straw men and arguments which were never made. And we need to move on from constantly arguing about, is this or is this not institutional racism, to the things that this strategy is trying to fix. Like, how do we make lives better for these people? How can we stop these people dying or being victims of crime, and so on and so forth?
Well, you've kicked back quite hard against some of the accusations against Sewell and others, the other authors of this report. I think you've warned of something called racialisation of Britain, the creeping racialisation of Britain. What do you mean by that?
I think if you look at every single thing through the prism of race, you don't necessarily make things better. And uh, there's an increasing scale of people doing that. I think I wrote in the Mail this week that a society that looks at everything through the prism of race and ethnicity is never going to be at ease with itself. And I bring this from personal experience, living in a country, growing up in a country that's Nigeria, where everybody looked the same, but we still had different ethnicities, different languages. If you focus on the difference all the time, people retreat into their tribes, they retreat into what is similar, and they start to look at anyone who is different from them as other. Whereas what we want to do is have a shared identity that everyone can come together on. That shared identity is being British, being one nation, and talking more about that and less about how different we are, I think will be helpful. But it doesn't mean that we won't analyze things on the basis of race, but we can't do it all the time at every level because it makes things harder, not easier.
Is there a danger in politics, and does this happen in your view, that race is exploited for political gains? A certain race, a certain demographic is wound up, jumped upon by a certain party or politicians to simply try and get their votes, and they exacerbate a problem that perhaps isn't quite as big as you might think it is.
I think it is undoubtedly true that race is exploited for political reasons, but you will find people making that accusations from both sides. I tend to think that the best thing to do is ensure that the kind of conversation we're having is not personalized and is not questioning people's motives. So if people have, if politicians or campaign groups or anyone has a suggestion about a particular type of policy or a request for government action, one way or another, looking at what is being asked for in and of itself without trying to judge whether is this person being racist, is that why they're pushing for this, or are they somebody who's trying to weaponize race, or are they a race hustler, and so on. It's just not very helpful. And that's why I found the attacks on the commissioners so noxious. And I think it was really shameful seeing MPs doing this, calling them racial gatekeepers and other really awful things. I think one Labour MP used a picture of the Ku Klux Klan to describe them. I mean, we just can't have that kind of conversation. We need to be serious. And there is a fundamental unseriousness in the way we talk about race sometimes that we have to stop.
I mean, these sort of accusations have been made towards you too. You are a black woman, you're a Conservative MP, a Conservative minister. So what do you say to people, and they exist on the left or campaigners, who say you've become one of them, you've become a part of the white Tory establishment, and you're yet again downplaying racism?
I think there will be many people on the left who will always say this because they cannot escape that narrative that if you are black, you must be oppressed and a victim. And if you're not saying that, then you're just denying your reality. That is not my reality at all. And I think it's very important that people like me continue to speak out and push against this sort of destructive narrative, because if we don't, then the assumption will be that those people who I think are on the extreme of the conversation are the mainstream. They are not. And the example I use is Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain. These are people who have very strong environmental objectives. The vast majority of people in the country also want a better environment and want policies that will do that. But we don't use the people who are shouting the most, who are most aggressive, as representative of the mainstream. And unfortunately, when it comes to race, we do that too often. They are not the mainstream. What they do is scare off the mainstream. So you would have heard about Tony Sewell having his honorary degree withdrawn for thinking that Britain is not a racist country.
Nottingham University did that this week.
Yes, exactly. That's going to have a chilling effect. So people who agree with Tony Sewell, people who agree with me, might, and I mean ethnic minority specifically, might think, oh, it's not really worth getting into this discussion. I don't want my life impacted in this way, which means that the space continues to be dominated by the extreme rather than the mainstream. And I'm working really hard to change that.
Let me ask you about another phrase, white privilege. That's thrown around quite a bit. Does white privilege still exist? And do you accept the criticism that you downplay it when you ask people not to use that phrase?
Well, it's a criticism. People might feel that way, but I don't think it's a helpful term at all. I don't think any term that fixates on people's skin color is a good thing. I think it's terrible. I think, again, it makes people feel differences. It makes people more separate. It is a very, very blunt way of describing something that is actually very complex and nuanced. There will always be, for any type of minority, whether it's racial or sexual or otherwise, there will always be differences which you have because you're not like everybody else. I don't think that you should then describe the majority as privileged because of that. I think what we should do is try and recognize what barriers might exist for those who are disadvantaged and seek to overcome them, rather than tell the larger majority that they've got something special which they should either be ashamed of or try and hide or check.
And if you look at some of the numbers, for example, education, poor white working class kids, white working class boys, have the worst results of every demographic. I think Chinese community at the top and white working class boys at the bottom. That would presumably negate, in your view, the idea that white privilege is universal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's too blunt. It doesn't even make sense when you look at it from the sort of perspective that you've given. We're in a place where people who are from white working class backgrounds who have been extremely deprived How can you talk about them being privileged because they may not have experienced a particular type of racism, but they would have experienced other disadvantages? I don't think we should have a competition about who is experiencing the worst sorts of things. I think we should be looking at how we can bring people together in order to make a better society and focus on how we can remove barriers for those who have them.
Let's talk about a few of the actions you're recommending in your plan, over 70 of them. One is quite interesting, and we'll obviously, there'll be a pretty passionate debate about this one, and that's the proposition of a new history curriculum for schools. Why does the current history curriculum for schools need to be revamped?
It doesn't need to be revamped so much as there needs to be more broadening of what kind of things can be taught, and more assistance for those schools that want to teach history in a way that might be more representative for their communities. So it's a model history curriculum. I think we have a model music curriculum, and it's basically going to be decided by a panel of experts. And what we want to see is a way of teaching history that weaves in all of the different facets of different ethnicities into the story of Britain, without making it seem like one particular ethnic group or skin color owns this type of history. But if you're Black, you need something different, like Black history. And if you're Asian, you need Asian history. British history belongs to all of us. And what we want to see is Black and Asian children looking at perhaps white historical figures, recognizing that that's their history, and the converse as well. White children looking at Black or Asian historical figures and recognizing that as their history as well, rather than a segregated history where, to be honest, in our country now, which is becoming super diverse, it'll be so difficult to give everyone the exact perfect flavor of history that they would like. So something unifying that can bring all different groups together is where we're trying to get to, and I think it will be successful.
One particular example, I suppose, that will cause controversy when we get into the statistics is empire. How do you teach about the British Empire? Because some might say it was a great thing, others might say it was a horrendous thing. What do you think we should do? Was empire a national embarrassment or a national point of pride?
Well, I'm not a historian. I think I would leave it to the panel of experts to decide that. But I think you should be saying both things. History isn't about trying to enforce a particular narrative or view. It's about telling the truth about things that happened. There were terrible things that happened during the British Empire. There were other good things that happened, and we need to tell both sides of the story. And what I find, comparing the way we talk about the British Empire now versus how I learned about it in Nigeria. In Nigeria, it was actually a very nuanced description that here are the good things that happened, here were these missionaries, these are the things they did, and here are some of the terrible things that happened. There wasn't any sort of attempt to describe British Empire as, look at this really awful, terrible thing that oppressed and victimized us. And I think my upbringing and schooling in another country has really influenced the way that I look at these things. I don't think making myself a victim is helpful at all. And I think that teaching young people to see themselves as victims rather than just the latest generation of an ever evolving story, I don't think that the former is helpful. I think the latter is.
I mean, empire was a result of colonialism, of course, and there are many who say colonialism itself, going to someone else's country and forcing them to live and behave and work in certain ways, is inherently evil. You wouldn't say colonialism is inherently wrong.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't go into that type of discussion. I don't think colonialism is right, but I also know that every country, one way or another, did so. So I know my ethnic group was colonized by another ethnic group in Nigeria. We also colonized other people. So I look at colonialism almost as a history of human beings always fighting, always at war, always trying to take something from the other, imposing cultural norms. That's how so many cultures have spread across the world. That's how so many languages have spread across the world. I think it's a complex thing. It shows, you know, some of the worst of human nature, but also some of the ways in which we as a species have evolved. And that's how I think we should talk about it, rather than pointing fingers and saying you lot did this and that lot did that. I just don't think it's helpful in order to build a better future, because we can't go into the past to fix the things that that occurred previously. All I can do now as a government minister is work for the children of today, the people who are alive today, and bring in policies that will be good for them. So people are asking me academic questions. What do you think about colonialism? What do you think about this or that? I just don't think it's a good use of my time. That's not what I'm here for. Let the university professors do that.
And now another action that your plan proposes is to develop a new national framework for the use of police powers. And that obviously includes stop and search as well, which has been fairly controversial in some communities. What do you want to see change with stop and search?
The biggest thing we found is that people in minority communities in particular, but generally, don't trust that they don't feel they're being treated fairly, might be heavy-handed. In ethnic minority communities, that they're being especially targeted. And it's a difficult one, because we know that stop and search helps prevent crime. So when campaigners say we want to abolish stop and search, we don't want to see it used, I know that that's not going to be good for those communities. You speak to the parents of children who've been stabbed or murdered or attacked, and they ask for more stop and search. And they think that if weapons were found before young people were able to use them, their children would have been alive today. So what we're trying to do is help bring about more trust. So we talk about accountability and scrutiny from local communities, letting them have more of a say and an understanding in how these powers are used, getting police officers to use their body-worn cameras, which can be actually quite essential in showing whether or not policing methods are fair. We police by consent in this country, and it's basically building on that principle.
Okay, so it should still exist. In other words, they should still have that
Yes,
power
yes,
to
absolutely,
stop and
absolutely.
search people of any demographic and race.
Using it more carefully and better is how I would summarize it.
Finally, Ms. Badenoch, you're a black MP. We've discussed that. You're a Tory MP. You're a woman. Have you suffered any racial prejudice, consciously or unconsciously, since getting elected and since walking the corridors of power?
Since getting elected, I would say the area that I see it happening is more online, definitely. So lots of online abuse, and it's not, as many people assume, from white nationalists who think I shouldn't be representing the country, although you do get a lot of that. It's actually from people who think that I'm some sort of person betraying my race by not saying the things that I'm expected to say. So there is a lot of that. But beyond that, I don't think I'm treated differently in the Houses of Parliament. In fact, I think because I am black and don't look like the Tory MP, people know, they recognize me more. I'm not confused for anyone else. I think I'm often sort of noticed and asked to do things. So I feel like I get special treatment. I feel like I get special treatment, which I wouldn't classify as racism, because it's positive. It's the treatment that's negative that is racism. But have I experienced it? Yes, mainly online. Sometimes in the constituency from people who are very angry that I represent somewhere where not a lot of people there look like me. But what is amazing is that the vast majority of people in the constituency do not think that. So I try to emphasize, especially when talking to young people, that there will always be racists among us, but they are actually the minority, and a small minority at that. And even though a small minority can cause a lot of problems and really ruin an experience, we must focus on the fact that most people are very positive, open, tolerant, and welcoming in our country, and that's something we should be proud of.
Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch, thanks so much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you, Tom.